So welcome to our political currency budget hot take. And whether you are watching this live now on YouTube or catching up this evening on our normal political currency feeds, you're really kind of welcome. Great to be here with you. We'll be doing our normal podcast on Thursday. So we'll have had time, as everybody will, to have absorbed and reflected upon what was in the budget, all of the detail. But this is our first budget hot take.
Yeah, actually, it takes me back, doesn't it, to kind of when you're in opposition and you have to kind of digest the budget really quickly and flick through the red book, which is the budget document the Treasury produces, look at the OBR forecast and document these days, although we all had a couple of hours jump on that because they inadvertently put it up online, which will be one of the big stories of Budget Day. Maybe we'll just start, shall we, with our overall impressions, your impression, my impression of the budget. And then we're going to get into some of the specifics and the things that jumped out at us. I mean, maybe I'll go first. I mean, I thought very much this was a budget for Labour MPs written by the Parliamentary Labour Party, rather than a budget aimed at even Labour voters, let alone kind of trying to get the British economy going, and therefore was sort of quite off strategy. It was not where I think Rachel Reeves would have wanted to start the year. I guess the headline, and I should say I thought she delivered it with confidence and spirit, but the headline really is that she's increasing taxes to increase benefits, because if you look in the figures, there hasn't been the big downgrade to the forecast that everyone's been talking about for months. The OBR did not really take a big chunk out of her plans for reasons we can get into. And so she was sort of left with this situation where she didn't actually have to do that much. But she decided that she was going to go ahead with these tax rises, and the bulk of the money was used to get rid of the 2-child limit, which I introduced as Chancellor. So we'll come on and talk about that. But that seems to me the sort of central decision in the budget. And it kind of, I guess, begs a question, which we can also come on to, which is, why did we spend the last 2 months in this kind of fevered speculation that there was going to be a big hole in the budget? She was going to put up income tax rates. And on the day, that hasn't happened. And we're left with, therefore, quite a sort of, in a kind of classic sense, left-wing budget, put up taxes on everyone to pay for higher benefits.
I think look, it was definitely a hugely political performance from Rachel Reeves. And, we'll see how this develops over the next 24, 48 hours. But on the OBR point first, if you watch the television between 12 and 12:30 today, when the BBC and Sky had got this leak of the whole OBR document, 200 pages, all of the information on the budget measures and the forecast, all the fiscally sensitive information. I mean, amazingly, the BBC on BBC Two didn't go to Prime Minister's questions. They were telling everybody what was in the budget before the budget was announced. George Parker, political editor of the Financial Times, did a tweet before 12:30 saying, "I've just finished writing the Financial Times budget splash." And that's even before the Chancellor has stood up in the House of Commons. My sense, though, is it didn't actually change very much. It clearly destabilised journalists, destabilised Parliament a little, and there will be huge post-mortems. Although Ken Clarke in '96, you, George, know what it's like to have a post-mortem about a budget reaction. I slightly thought she missed a trick. What she ought to have said, rather than being angry, is she should have said, Rachel Reeves, in the chamber at 12:30, that she felt terribly sorry for the poor junior OBR official who had pressed the wrong button, and they'll be hugely fearful for their future, and they should rest assured we all make mistakes. In the end, though, the world moves on. And in terms of...
just on that, Ed, the fact that there was because everything had come out before in the press, what was going to be in the budget, it didn't reveal the OBR leak, some white rabbit that she was going to pull out of the hat at the end of the speech, was it? So it would have had more impact if there was some big surprise she had in.
That's right.
Big theatrical surprise. So as a result, it had less political impact than it might have done on another budget day.
And the interesting thing, Rachel Reeves has clearly decided she doesn't like big surprises. and she wants everything to be out in advance, which kind of slightly jars with the idea of budget purdah. The advantage of that, of course, is going really well, then the fact it's already announced is fine, because you just get the plaudits. But if, as has been the case in the last 2 or 3 weeks, it's been kind of totally chaotic. I think the one thing she really needed was a big rabbit out of the hat, and she didn't have one there. It was very Rachel Reeves' chancellorial performance, because there was a lot of there was a lot of my choices. There was a lot of only I can do this. You're doubling down on that message which you've seen in the last few weeks, saying that only I can keep the markets on side. There will be more redaction. Just to explain what this means for people, the Treasury civil servants will put out a version of the budget speech. They will black out any sections of the speech which are party political, and that's called redacting. I think in our time at the Treasury, there would have been basically no redactions in Gordon Brown's budget speeches. I don't remember you doing many redactions. Almost all of this budget speech will be redacted because it was so aggressively political. And as you said, if your problem is the people behind you and you need to keep them on side, then you go heavy political. But if you're trying to persuade the newspapers, the swing voters, the wider public, when it's that partisan, I think it makes it a bit harder. So as you said, she made that decision, and maybe she needed to make that decision, but it's not without costs. I think, though, as I said earlier, we're going to come back and look at lots more detail tomorrow. She had her own tests, cost of living, the National Health Service getting the debt down. There was clearly a markets test. Will this stabilize the British economy? There is a sort of test. Will this deliver the growth plan she needs? And then there is a political test. Will this deliver for Rachel Reeves and turn round what has been a pretty torrid period? I think on the markets, they basically pass the test. Almost no financial market reaction to this budget, even with that OBR leak. It was a little bit wobbly for that 10 minutes, but in the end, nothing's changed. Of course, these things sometimes take time to sink in, and there may be measures which unravel, but at the moment it looks quite calm. She is meeting her fiscal rules by the end of the period. She's doubled the amount of margin by which she's going to meet her fiscal rules. So this is a little bit more cautious. But as you said, what's fundamentally gone on here is that the OBR, for all the talk of them doing a huge downgrade to the forecast, they did a downgrade to the underlying view of growth, and then hugely upgraded the amount of money they think is coming in taxation from any percentage point of growth. And the result is there wasn't really a problem with the OBR forecast. And what we've really seen here is a huge rise in taxation in order to pay for a bit more margin and a lot more spending on, in particular, on welfare. So in that sense, it's a pretty classic tax and spend budget. But I think if you're the markets, you would think, well, the tax rises don't happen until year 3. There's a few hidden problems in there, around the spending assumptions look quite low after the spending review finished. In 29, 30, 30, 31, there's suddenly big cuts in public spending. There's a sort of a bit of a black hole which the OBI identifies around SEND spending, which is special needs spending for children, which ends up being about £5 billion a year they've got to find. Fuel duty, they're continuing to kick that can down the road. But fundamentally, she's met the fiscal rules with margin, and the markets are going to shrug their shoulders.
Yeah, I think that's broadly right. There's not been a financial market reaction. Now, most budgets, there isn't a financial market reaction. We've just got used to, in this kind of new era, that there might well be, and there hasn't been. And I guess that's markets reassured that she is committed to these fiscal rules. She restated that today. We knew she would. And that the measures that she announced are broadly credible, and that she's not in immediate danger, nor is the Prime Minister, of resigning or being forced out. So I think sort of nothing to see here on the financial market front. Should we turn then to the what about the impact on the economy? Maybe we should, for those who haven't actually caught the budget, just mention a couple of the sort of headline measures and then see what that does for the overall economic performance of the government. So she froze the income tax and national insurance thresholds for another 3 years. Rishi Sunak had already frozen them, I think, for 7 years. So this is a very, very long freeze in the thresholds. And that's doing a lot of the work, by the way, as you say, to raise the current freeze, the Sunak freeze, is one of the reasons why the public finances haven't deteriorated in the way that people had expected, because inflation's a bit higher. And so more money is coming in from tax receipts, thanks to the freeze. And the productivity downgrade, which you referred to, is offset basically by higher wages and higher inflation, leading to higher tax receipts. And the overall impact is only that there's a £6 billion hole. Now, £6 billion sounds a lot to people, but in the scheme of the Treasury, it's not. So she throws the thresholds for another 3 years. We'll come on to the politics of that, because it's something she previously said she wouldn't do. She abolished the 2-child limit on welfare, which we talked about, which we mentioned, heavily anticipated, but she went for the whole hog, didn't she? She introduced a mansion tax in effect, or 2 higher council tax bands for homes worth over £2 million. She put a charge on electric vehicles. She taxed higher pension contributions. She actually, somewhat surprisingly, I don't think it was anticipated, she increased the income tax and national insurance on pensions and dividend tax. And there were lots of other smaller things which actually raised quite a lot of money, which she didn't make much of. But things like change to some of the writing down allowances for businesses raises a lot of money. Freezing student loan thresholds raises quite a lot of money. I mean, the overall impact on the economy and the sort of plan for growth, I would say, is next to nothing. I mean, there was measure, to be fair. To be fair to her, she did talk about, some of the industrial policy, more money for transport, but there was nothing really significant. No big new supply side reform to the economy. No huge increase in capital investment beyond what was announced last year. So I think we'll come back to what this means for the politics, but in terms of the economics of the country, this is not really going to move the needle on GDP, is it? And I don't think she claimed it would. The only thing she did claim it did was that it reduced the forecast inflation by 0.4%, which she's very proud of, and I guess would address the kind of quotes cost of living challenge that she set herself.
That's right. I think, though, compared to past budgets, and this partly goes to your observation of how political and backbench orientated one was, I don't remember a chancellor spending so little time talking about the international economy and the broader global context, even though that's clearly massively important for Britain at the moment. And in her press conference in Downing Street a couple of weeks ago, that's what she really focused on. And secondly, there was very little directed at business and the growth strategy. Very little talk about incentives for investment or what the growth plan was. And there was a small number of kind of capital spends here and there, but they don't really add up to a huge amount. There wasn't a kind of decisive push in those things. I don't remember a chancellor being less business growth orientated. And then when you move to the forecast, so growth is downgraded, the overall growth number every year for the next 5 years. You're right, inflation is less next year, but overall inflation stays a bit higher over this period. But I think the significant thing in their forecast is what she said about, or what the OBR says about incomes. Real household disposable income. This is the income that everybody will get and feel. Real household disposable income per person is now projected to grow more slowly. It grows by 3% last year, 2024-25, down to 0.5% this year, 0.25% in 26-27, and then averages 0.25% a year for the rest of the forecast. That is well below, the OBR says, the last decade's average of just under 1%. So the last decade, household incomes were growing just under 1%, and everybody said that is a huge squeeze on people's incomes, and that 1% is now going to fall to 0.25%. So that underlying growth slowdown for the UK is then reflected in what is a real, very tight household disposable income growth, and of course, alongside that, you've got taxes rising. Now, within that forecast, there is a small increase in borrowing in the next 2 or 3 years. As I said, the fiscal tightening happens late, but I don't think people will think that's hugely significant. There is a small tick up in migration, which contributes to growth, even though the growth numbers are slower. I think we go from around the low 200,000 back up to 340,000 a year migrants is the forecast in the OBR forecast. But I think the most significant thing here is that investment is not strong, exports aren't strong, growth isn't strong, and people's incomes are going to be squeezed. This is not an easy economic environment to do politics, and it's a continuation of the last 15, 20 years, but if anything, it's tightening.
So let's get to the kind of raw politics of it. Although, of course, what you're saying is going to affect the overall political situation. I mean, there's this very, very big decision, isn't there, that ends up raising £12 billion in tax by the end of the period, of freezing the thresholds, and it's a classic. It is the classic stealth tax. It is that was how this phrase was first kind of enter British politics. It's something people don't really notice, but in effect, because inflation is increasing, because inflation is up, and you don't increase the point at which you pay tax by inflation, it just sucks more and more people both into the income tax system in the first place. So low-income people suddenly have to pay tax, and second, it takes sort of middle-income people into higher bands, and it raises a lot of money. It was used by the last Tory government, by Rishi Sunak, both as Chancellor and then as Prime Minister.
On page 76, George, of the OBR document is a table which shows the new taxpayers coming into income tax and existing taxpayers going up to the higher rate or to the additional rate band. And it's basically £3 to £4 million additional kind of each year rising. I mean, there are
3 to 4 million people
who are now going to be paying the higher rate or the additional rate. So I think I saw that the 1 in 4 will be paying a higher rate, not the basic rate. I mean, this is a dramatic change in our tax system.
Yes, and the fact it's happened, it's essentially a bipartisan move, because it's happened under both a Tory and a Labour government now. And the pretense that Labour were going to end it, which Rachel Reeves made a big deal of last year. She said, "I'm ending it. It's a tax on working people." She's decided to go ahead. Now, people may not have noticed, if there hadn't been all that speculation about putting up the main rates of income tax, but as a result, everyone's looking at income tax in this budget. And the odd thing here, I think the odd political judgment, is she's decided to go ahead with this thing, which clearly breaches what she promised she wouldn't do in the last budget. There'll be a row about this, but many people will assume and interpret this as a breach of the manifesto commitment not to raise taxes on working people. Indeed, she herself said in the budget last year, "I'm not doing this because this would break our manifesto." This year, she is doing it, although she says it doesn't break the manifesto. And that begs the big question of why, because you don't need the money to fill the black hole in the public finances, because the OBR didn't create that huge black hole. And the smaller hole it did create could easily have been filled by some of the other things she did on pension contributions and dividend tax and so on. So the big question is why? And you alluded to it at the beginning of this live broadcast. The first is she's built up a headroom, so she's not going to be thrown off course, she hopes, again next year with changes to the economic forecast, forcing her to kind of come back for more money, although it's still quite a small headroom in the scale of the size of the economy. And then she's abolished the 2-child limit. Now, we've had many debates about it on this program. I introduced it, and I think there's a very strong fairness argument. that people on benefits should face the same kind of lifestyle choices that everyone else has to face. And when you have more children, that usually costs families more. You have argued strongly that it's not fair and it increased child poverty and it should be abolished. We don't want to rehearse, I think, this afternoon, all those arguments. We can come back to them on our regular podcast. I think the kind of interesting thing for me to ask you is, earlier this year, Rachel Reeves seemed to set her stall against doing this. When the Parliamentary Labour Party defeated her plans and Liz Kendall's plans to cut disability benefits, what she said to them is, right, well, we're definitely not abolishing the 2-child limit. Here we are a few months later, and it was the absolute centerpiece rhetorically of the budget, wasn't it? It was the bit that she labored through in the sense of wanting to milk it for the purposes of her own backbenches. We know in the polling it is not popular. It's not popular with all voters. It's not popular with Labour voters. So she wasn't doing it in order to win a big applause in the country, although I guess she'll hope she can change people's minds about its benefits over time. But it was designed to win a big cheer in the chamber, and it did win the big cheer in the chamber. But it is something she had said only a couple of months ago she wouldn't do, and it's very classic: taxes up on everyone in order to pay, for more benefits for a few. And it's worth saying in passing, I thought Kemi Badenoch had a pretty effective response as leader of the opposition. Not an easy thing to do. She's definitely having a good autumn, Kemi Badenoch. And, I think her kind of central message, which is this is a budget for Benefit Street paid for by taxes on working people, is a pretty effective conservative line of attack over the coming years. So kind of my question to you is, why does she do it when she had previously said or indicated she wouldn't do it?
Well, I think there are 3 different explanations you can give. One is just the moral case. Gordon Brown has been championing this all year, that it is wrong that children are being disadvantaged in this way, and it should be sorted out. And he makes that moral case for action. And I think in her kind of gut, Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer will agree with Gordon Brown that, and I've made versions of that argument on our podcast. But earlier in the year, Rachel Reeves was saying that there wasn't the money for it and she wasn't going to do it. So that can't be the reason for this change. The second explanation is about political weakness, that the Parliamentary Labour Party, the backbench MPs, even though there's a huge majority, are disgruntled and disrupted and are wanting a strategy and to feel that they can believe in the future. And you just had a deputy leadership election in which Lucy Powell from outside the cabinet and Bridget Phillipson from inside the cabinet both agreed in public the one thing they wanted action on was getting rid of this 2-child limit. And the huge cheers from Labour MPs is because it is what backbench MPs wanted. And so the second explanation could be that they're under pressure after the winter fuel allowance and the welfare reform screw ups, and they needed to throw some red meat. I think there's a third explanation, which in a way goes to the conversation which we've started and we'll carry on our podcast tomorrow, which is the trajectory from here until election day. Because when Rachel Reeves says she's going to spend more money to reduce child poverty, and this is going to be controversial, not least because you've already had Neil O'Brien pointing out the large number of people who claim universal credit who aren't born or don't have citizenship in the UK. And you can imagine how Nigel Farage is going to jump into that debate. Although, interestingly, Nigel Farage has been one of the people advocating getting rid of the 2-child limit because he wants people to have more kids. I think he probably has a view about who should have the extra kids.
Yes.
But the counterpart to the reducing child poverty was, without doing this, child poverty was going to rise dramatically in the second, third, and fourth year of a Labour government, partly because of the way in which you design the policy, because more families come into the net of the 2-child limit as their children grow older. And so child poverty was going to rise. And you can imagine Rachel Reeves thinking, do I really want to be a Labour Chancellor presiding over not just a squeeze on people's incomes, but rising child poverty? And maybe the same voters who can say, I'm not sure, I think it's a good idea, can say, but if Labour's not for reducing child poverty, what's it for? So it may be that they thought that if they're going to act, now is the time to do it. If it was me, I think I would have been more cautious, and I think you could have raised the limit from 2 till 3. I've advocated that before, but they went the whole hog. And is that because that was what they needed to get child poverty coming down? Was that what they needed politically, or did Rachel Reeves just decide that she wanted to do this morally? I can't give you the answer. I'm not inside her head, but it's certainly some combination of those arguments.
I think the other interesting thing, we often say on our podcast that politics is about choices, and we try and bring those to life for people. So there's one choice here is which she could easily have delivered this budget and avoided having to freeze income tax thresholds and met her fiscal rules. So she has chosen to increase income tax. It's not been really, forced on her by the economic and fiscal circumstances, which was what people were thinking a few weeks ago would be the case. The other choice is she's used this, the money that was therefore available to do this measure that is really directed at the Labour Party members of Parliament. I say not really Labour Party voters, according to the opinion polls. And she didn't use a huge amount of money to address kind of cost of living. There was lots of speculation she might get rid of VAT on domestic fuel, for example. That would have been a much more sort of populist, aimed directly at voters measure. Now there were some things in this space, of which the most kind of notable is getting rid of something called the energy company obligation, which is really kind of boring and technical, but basically was a requirement on energy companies funded by people's electricity bills, by a charge on people's electricity bills and gas bills, to insulate people's homes and make homes more energy efficient. And I just wanted to observe this other feature of the budget, which I think is quite interesting. It's what David Cameron would have said in private, or that got reported in public at the time. It's time to ditch the green crap. That's what David was reported as saying. I mean, she has got rid of a central green measure in our energy system.
Although the government, I think, is still paying for it, aren't they?
They are paying for bits of it, but she's also introduced a new charge on electric vehicles, a per mile charge on electric vehicles. I would say, by the way, if there's anything likely to run into serious parliamentary trouble with the Parliamentary Labour Party, it might be the electric vehicle road user charging, which is also, I would say, a Treasury Trojan horse into road user charging, which we've never had in Britain. And we've had fuel duty, but as more and more people switch to electric cars, they're introducing a brand new tax on how much you drive, which has never existed before. And she froze fuel duty, which was a really expensive thing for her to do. And all the previous chancellors for, years and years, starting with Gordon Brown, have done that. But if you took a step back, it's quite a kind of anti-green. It's very, very different from the Ed Miliband Green Deal, the transformation of the economy as part of our industrial strategy. And you've ended up with a series of quite sort of anti-green measures. Although I think they can all be justified individually. I'm talking about the overall impression. And I also thought it was probably the first time a chancellor in the entire history of the budget has ever talked about the Green Party in a budget speech, that which is a feature of the fact that they are now much more prominent than they have ever been before. What did you am I overinterpreting all of this? I thought it felt like quite a switch from the Labour Party of 2023-24, the Green Deal, this as being a centerpiece of industrial policy, to let's get rid of some of these green charges and tax people who do green things.
I mean, I think you are right to highlight it, although it's slightly counter to where we started. The Times leader said this was going to be a Labour budget for Labour MPs, and you pointed out that on the two-child limit being abolished, that is where the cheers came from. But I'm not sure how many cheers should have been getting for backing off those green measures. Definitely from some Labour MPs who are worrying about it, but there'll be lots of other Labour MPs quite worried about Zach Belansky and what the Greens are up to in their own constituencies, will be concerned about that. There'll be lots of people also wondering whether or not The growth agenda is really going to deliver, and that income squeeze. I think, though, the thing which maybe we should end here because we're going to come back to talk about this tomorrow. But the point you made earlier, just about income tax and the freezing of the thresholds. I mean, don't forget last year's budget for the final year of this Parliament for 29. 30, the furthest the government can go in electoral terms. Last year, Rachel Reeves raised £39 billion in tax in that year, and this budget adds another £23 billion. So there's going to be a £62 billion tax rise happening at the end of the Parliament, which is potentially a Parliament in which incomes haven't risen a great deal. There is a margin in the fiscal rules. And she's hoping that will be a war chest, which she can draw down upon to mitigate some of those tax rises. But is that going to be possible? And then, as you said, in last year's budget, she said she wasn't going to freeze income tax allowances because they hit working people. We had a press conference in Downing Street a few weeks ago in which she said she was going to level with people about the scale of the challenge. Everybody had to make their contribution. The very clear view was they were going to be open and straight with people, that to tackle the big issues facing Britain, given the global challenges, we couldn't stick with a manifesto. And now we've had a budget which has done this year in the billions of pounds what last year the Chancellor said she wouldn't do because it would hurt working people. And rather than sort of saying it's what we need to do because everybody makes a contribution, it looks like they're going to maintain the line that actually, is kind of consistent with the manifesto, really. I mean, it's not really an income tax rise. And I think there'll be lots of Labour MPs who will be thinking, is that actually a sustainable and winnable argument now? Given the last 3 or 4 weeks, I think it's much harder to go and do a television interview and say, we've kept to our manifesto. There isn't a problem, because people will think, well, I know, but you haven't, and you've done what you said you wouldn't do, and you told us all you were going to be open with us, and have you really been? And the only way out of this is for this economy to grow more strongly in the next 2 or 3 years. That eases the fiscal pressure, it eases the tax pressure, it eases the living standards pressure, and this was not a budget which gave you confidence that either the Treasury or the OBR think there is, a rising feel-good growth factor going to come through the next 2 or 3 years. And so, when the reality sinks in, this is actually a tough political ask for a Labour MP to swallow, I'd say.
I mean, no one wants to be compared to the Duke of York these days, but it is reminiscent of the nursery rhyme, isn't it? The Grand Old Duke of York. I think she marched people up the hill of saying there's a hole in the finances. I'm going to stick to my fiscal rules. I'm going to put up income tax. Everyone's going to have to pay. And then when the hole didn't materialize, she didn't want to take everyone right down the bottom of the hill. So she went ahead with the freeze on income tax thresholds. That's a tax on working people. It's, in all senses, that most people would understand the Labour manifesto, a breach of that manifesto commitment. And then she uses the money for benefits and, something that's not very popular in the country, whatever one thinks of the kind of fairness argument. And that's quite a big political choice, because if you try and anticipate where the election is going to be fought in a few years' time, the poor performance of the economy and the rising benefits bill are going to feature very heavily. And I thought just 2 things to sort of end with as observations. Next to nothing on the NHS. So surprising. Labour chancellors in the past, would always major on the NHS. And she did say in that Downing Street speech a few weeks ago that the NHS was one of her 3 priorities, mentioned only in passing today. And then there's something in the OBR report, which you could have read before she stood up as a result of their mistake. And it says the tax take is going to reach an all-time high in our history. I'm paraphrasing here, but it's an all-time high of 38% of GDP by 2030. So you'll be going into the general election with taxes at a record high. But, I guess a kind of progressive Labour government that had got its act together would be out there defending that. Whereas I feel what you can say about this performance, this budget, as I say, I thought she was spirited, and I guess she lives to fight another day. But is that enough?
Well, she's got through today. And I think her team will think that despite the OBR leak, she's had a good day, but a good day after what has been, a torrid few weeks, few months, which and some massive political challenges to come. And we'll kind of dig in more into the how this Parliament now unfolds when we do the main podcast tomorrow. We've had some questions coming in while we've been talking, which we intended to do, but we have EMQs, and we'll have a special budget EMQs this week to make sure we answer people's questions. But it's not too late. So if you can send your questions into questions at politicalcurrency.co.uk on the budget, then we will get to do those on Friday if you're a Gold or Kitchen Cabinet member, or Monday for everybody else. But I think that's probably it for this special live episode of
we're not going to answer the
Budget Hot
question. Hold on, before you finish. What about this question? I'm
Well,
sure
we are
Ed will
40
agree
minutes
with
in,
me
George.
when.
Oh, I see. Oh,
I'm
come
sure
on,
Ed
go
will
on.
agree with me when I say we need George back as Chancellor.
Well,
And we're not
Rachel
going to
Reeves,
address.
she did rather go out of her way to say that there was no return to austerity, and I think that's because Rachel Reeves definitely does not think that she's the return to George Osborne.
Unlike the good questions we have from James and Hugo, we will try and respond to these. That question was anonymous, so unfortunately, it might have come from a sort of AI-generated bot or something. But
if I had to guess, I'd say Mac Hancock. That's what I'm guessing.
Thank you very much for joining us today in this live broadcast on YouTube. But you can also, many of you will be listening to it as well as a podcast that's popped into your podcast feed. Thank you.
And we'll see you for our regular episode tomorrow, when we will, day 2 of the budget, George. As you know from Omni Shambles year, that is when it really starts to unravel.
That's when Marie Antoinette turned up outside the Treasury and started handing out pasties to the officials.
That's when David Cameron thought he'd had a pasty on Leeds Station, and it turned out the pasty shop had shut some years ago. We will see you for our normal podcast tomorrow, and thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.